Hi everyone, my name is Pooja Mistry, and I'm going to be talking to you all about innovative approaches to testing GraphQL APIs. So it's been kind of a long day. We're kind of at the end of this conference, and if you haven't been able to tell by my orange sweatshirt, I work for Postman. So I am a developer advocate for Postman, and I was hoping that this session's going to be a little fun because I have some good swag at the end that we'll probably take a quiz at the end, and I'll just like throw it at you. So, but yeah, we're going to go a little bit back to the basics. I know I'm at a GraphQL conference. You guys probably know about GraphQL way more than I do, but I like to I've been learning about GraphQL this year, especially because my colleague Tim in the back, who created this really awesome client for learning GraphQL. So I kind of took this approach for understanding GraphQL myself. So I've heard that GraphQL is a query language. It's a little bit different from REST APIs, but for me, it takes me a little bit of a harder time to understand how it works. So I like to think of it in metaphors, really. And so my favorite type of metaphor is like a food metaphor. And so I like to think about GraphQL as like a buffet, right? And so the goal is to minimize the number of trips you're going to make and make sure you pack your plates full of food in that way. So you have more of a customized selection. You can choose what exactly you want to eat. You can add and combine different items on, and then eventually that leads to ultimately more efficiency and flexibility compared to REST, which you have much more of a predefined options, and you're trying to make multiple requests in more of a fixed structure in that way. So with that, what I've kind of seen on the internet about GraphQL is that ultimately you're able to have one query where you can send all of your endpoints with one specific URL versus with REST APIs, you have multiple endpoints, which can lead to sending multiple calls or overfetching of data. So ultimately, I like this picture a lot because it made me really think about GraphQL in terms of machines. So for example, like with a vending machine, right? You're getting exactly what you need. When you press A1, you get your Diet Coke. But with a gumball machine, you put in your quarter, but you don't. If you want the green gumballs, you don't even know. You might have to twist that quarter a couple of times to get the data. And I watched the GraphQL documentary. I think they said something like this in there, so I just wanted to put that quote in there. But ultimately, this is something that we don't really talk about as much when it comes to GraphQL is testing, and something maybe we dive a little bit deeper into when it comes to working with REST. And so testing is such a big aspect, and there's lots of aspects that I've seen when it comes to GraphQL of what to test. You have to test your queries and mutations. You have to test the flow of operations. You have to validate your schemas. How do we handle errors with testing? And then what I've seen with GraphQL, it seems like there's a lot more complex queries, and you can run into issues with synchronization, with performance. So there's a lot of aspects in GraphQL to test. And y'all might be wondering, well, I don't know how you guys test GraphQL, but you can do it with a lot of interesting tools, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways you can do it with Postman as well. So, and it's like GraphQL is so interesting because it started at Facebook, and it kind of made me really think. I think what their whole thing was, they had so many nested structures. If you think about a Facebook comment, you have your news feed, your user timeline, your posts, your comments, your likes. You have so many nested features, and when it comes to testing, there's a lot of elements there that that can be overlooked. So I kind of broke this up into some key components when it comes to testing. So testing can involve schemas, queries, mutations, working with resolvers, and ultimately you're testing whether or not your fields or outputs are what you're looking for ultimately. So, but then there's a ton of challenges. So you have complex query structures, and you have a lot of nested resolvers. So I can see how testing a long query with all of these nested elements can be pretty tough feat. But if you have some interesting tools, and I'm going to show you some tools in my tool belt at least with testing, you'll be able to kind of take your approach of facing these challenges head on in 3 different ways. So I like to talk about 3 types of ways you can test. So the first type of way you can test is schema validation testing. So schema validation is making sure that you're getting exactly what you have developed in your schema as your proof of correctness, and you're getting that schema back. So if you're asking for strings, you're making sure that you're validating that you get back a string. So you have a blueprint to follow, and essentially this is one of the root places to start when it comes to testing any GraphQL API. The next testing I like to think about is response validation. Am I getting the right responses back? Am I getting the right data that I am expecting with my nested queries? And then finally, mocking and snapshot testing. So this is really important with GraphQL because you want to mock your data in a lot of different ways. And so making sure that if you pass in the right data, is your system performing effectively? So with that, I want to just dive into how we can do some of this type of testing. And I tried not to make it like too Postman heavy, but we're going to use Postman. But take this as a learning opportunity to learn a new tool, and we can kind of go from there. So let's kind of dive into a little bit of testing. So let's go into my my example. Are you all able to see this okay? All right. So if you haven't worked with Postman and GraphQL, we have a specific client that is really interesting to use. So you can actually add any URL into your URL bar, and if you have introspection enabled, you can do a lot of really interesting things. So like, for example, I'm going to go ahead and create a new GraphQL. If I have any introspection URL enabled, you can see that I can load my schema automatically. And this is one thing that I really love about GraphQL, because with REST, I have to see what the data looks, I have to look at the documentation to find what the schema looks like, what endpoints I'm going to test. And I kind of love that you can see the entire the schema within Postman like this. So I have an example where we're using the Postman Echo server. So this is a tool that my colleagues Mina, who spoke earlier, and Doc worked on. And Echo is a really powerful tool. Just for any of you who are testers out there, Echo gives you anything that you give it back. So if you're just kind of playing around with something, Echo is a great endpoint to work with. So when it comes to schema validation testing, we have some scripts within Postman that allow you to actually validate exactly what your schema looks like. So you can imagine setting your schema blueprint here, and you are using the Postman pm.test to validate if your response has the right schema. So this is kind of an interesting way to kind of test any types of schemas. Another way to work with schemas is I like to work with creating a GraphQL API. So I can always create a new GraphQL, a new API, and with Postman, you can work with a repository, or you can add any definition. So we have a lot of different definition types supported. So here we're going to work with GraphQL, and basically, you have a schema that you can edit and you can add different types to. And this is something, if you're going to do, I guess, schema first testing, if you wanted to develop your schema and then use that to test, this is a great approach. So in this case, I have this one GraphQL API here that I'm already going to use. Let me add just like another field into this, so just to test on my end. And so if I save that, I can import my schema accordingly. And you can see that my query has been imported. So like if I were to use like this GraphQL API and import that schema, it should load that GraphQL API, and I'm able to kind of test all of my fields that I've created. So it allows you to kind of build those inter-nested fields and arguments when it comes to working with GraphQL. So that's an interesting way to kind of work with schemas. Now, when we come to field validation, I have very simple API where, I'm sending it some sort of query back, and you can see that there are scripts I can use. I can use scripts to make sure that my query is successful. It has certain types of property. I can test the response time. But I can also work really interestingly with variables and arguments to kind of create a little bit more of a dynamic workflow. So here I can set a query before I send my test, and then create some sort of test to validate my responses as well. So in this case, you're expecting that test to fail. So you're seeing that validation of your output pretty successfully there. So this can get really dynamic. So if you work with environment variables, let's say you have, in this case, I have like a couple of fields, but if I had like 5 or 6 different arguments, I can work with variables to replicate that, the dynamic workflow of validating the end-to-end schema. So there's a lot of interesting field validation that you can do with Postman as well. And then, of course, when it comes to mocking data, there's a lot you can do with Postman. So in this case, I am querying, let's see, so I'm working with 2 different types of operations. I'm working with the query operation and the mutation operation. So here, I'm just adding some mock data, for example, random names, and these are inbuilt with Postman. So you don't need to mock it by using anything else. These are part of Postman's libraries. So if I look at some of the dynamic variables that are part of Postman's library, for example, random addresses, random passwords, we got random protocols, you can get random IDs. This kind of helps you mock and test your APIs pretty successfully in that way. So for example, if I want to send this query, I get, here I'm doing a mutation where I'm creating this person with a random name and age, and then I can also send it just a query, and then you can see that I'm sending some random data that, imagine if you wanted to send that into some sort of database and do a little bit more testing on that front. So yeah, so these are the 3 aspects when it comes to testing Postman. Schema validation, data response validation, and then mocking and snapshot testing. There's a lot more testing you can do, of course. There's, functional testing, security testings. I think these are all kind of interwoven in the whole aspect of testing your GraphQL APIs. I think we all talk about the fun of development and all of that, but when it comes to testing, it's really a lot about the kind of use cases that make sense, especially when you have such deep nested fields to validate in terms of integration. And so there are a couple of better practices when it comes to testing. So when I think about testing, prioritizing common scenarios, so starting with scenarios that have some sort of realistic representation of what your application is going to be doing, how it's going to be used in production, and what it's going to be ultimately applied to and integrated to, planning your tests carefully. So with GraphQL, like I mentioned, there's a lot of nested elements. How can you plan for the happy path scenarios? How can you plan for the negative path scenarios? What are you going to Planning for every type of scenario requires a lot of interesting effort prior to even beginning some of your testing. And you can, with these scenarios in mind, you can actually organize your collections as so. So you can create a collection for just your positive test cases. You can create a collection for your negative test cases. So Postman kind of not only helps you test, but kind of organize and plan your data carefully. And then, of course, simulating real-world test cases against production. So I wanted to just share this slide because our team has worked really hard on some GraphQL concepts. So if this is something that's interesting to you, feel free to take a picture of this. And then I have also a lot more resources I wanted to share. So for example, what is GraphQL? Working with GraphQL and Postman, we have some videos as well as a lot more resources that that are really interesting to share. So with that, I just wanted to, wrap it up. But let's. I don't know if I'm short on time, but I think the next talk after this is Dimitri. But the talk after that is at 5 o'clock. So I feel like I have a little time to do like a little bit of swag giveaway quizzes. So I'm going to ask somebody some questions. So can somebody name the 3 types of operations for GraphQL? Oh, nice. That was easy. Okay. All right. I talked about a lot of different testing types with GraphQL. Can anyone name one of the testing types I talked about and explain it? Or just at least name one of them? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. All right. So I got some sacks for you. Oh, sorry. All right. Okay. Can someone give me a good GraphQL metaphor? Buffet. Woohoo! We all love a good buffet. All right. What else? What are some GraphQL elements? What is a query comprised of? Like, what are the 2 elements that are comprised of? You already did one. Yeah, I was thinking about like. Yeah, who said that? Okay, good job. All right. Oops, that was bad. And then I actually have these 2 really great books. They're called API First World books. But I need some harder questions, and I'm not very good at hard questions. Pascal, do you have any? Tim? Who said that? All right, you get a book, but I'm not going to throw it at you. All right. Any more hard questions? Oh, Tim. Who went to Tim's talk today? It was all about GraphQL tooling. What was the library that was like really? No? Okay, never mind if you didn't go to his talk. What year was GraphQL created? All right. 2012. Who said 2012? Ooh, yeah, you get it. All right. Well, with that, I hope you guys had a great time at my talk and got to learn a lot about GraphQL testing and are going to try out some stuff with Postman. So, thank you.